Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Church History. I'm Teresa Father.
Thank you, Teresa. Good to be back.
It's good to have you here.
I'd say there are three trends that are happening, and we can talk together about this in the next couple of weeks. Three trends happening, and this is happening in the 1400s, the 15th century, in the religious community, in the church. And first of all, there is a Reformation going on, a Catholic Reformation in which the Reformers are drawing believers to the center of the church.
Okay.
And these are not necessarily saints. We won't find a lot of saints during this period of time, but we will find good, solid churchmen whose love for the church is causing the church to reform internally and drawing people to the center of the church.
Okay.
And we saw the beginnings of that. If you remember, last time around, the aftermath of the Council of Constance, with the growth of the religious orders, the monasteries once again, the Rosary, at the Devotio Moderna, Thomas à Kempis, all of those things. We'll talk about a little bit more about them a little bit later on, and the role that they play in popular piety and the strength of devotion in the people. Now that's one trend taking place. So reformers that are drawing us toward the center of the church. There are also going to be reformers that are going to be going the other direction. They're going to be taking people, believers, away from the center of the church and ultimately out of the church. And that is what we typically call the Reformation. We'll be talking a little bit about some of them today. Okay. And then the third trend that's taking place is at the center itself, at Rome. What's going on at Rome, especially among the popes and the papal entourage, the curia. And here we have, if we look at this honestly, we see a sincere effort on the part of popes, even the Renaissance popes, towards strengthening the institution of the church. Now, they're not going to be necessarily holy men. This isn't the era of saintly popes, but they are going to be dedicated to the institution of the church and exhibiting, showing the splendor of the Catholic Church in art, in architecture, in literature. It's a movement that's called Christian humanism.
Okay.
And we'll take a look at that also. That's well worth taking a look at. Very often during this period of time, as people would go, typically we would rush through this period very quickly. And so when we would talk about the popes, when we talk about that third trend, the center, we just zero in on maybe two or three popes, two in particular, and look at the abuses within their own lives and say, well, corrupt church, therefore. And what that leads to, if you look at this, if you fast forward this century very, very quickly, what you end up with is what looks like a church full of abuses, and you come up with what's called the abuse theory. And the abuse theory basically says this: there were terrible abuses in the church. These lead to the Reformation, and the Reformation is a result of the Reformers' righteous indignation. In fact, this is much more complex than that. And so if we go back and instead of zipping through this period very rapidly and broad brushing everything, if we actually look at individuals and look at what they're saying, we begin to pick up trends and patterns. And I think that honestly you would see these three trends. At least last summer, as I was doing all of my reading in preparation for a course at the seminary, I, for the first time, really read this century in slow motion, and people began coming out, and I began seeing things, and I had a couple of these aha experiences. So what I'd like to do today is then take a look at the trends in theology that would lead reformers away from the center of the church, towards splitting the church. Next week, take a look at what's happening at the center of the church, the Renaissance itself. The week after that, take a look at what was going on within the church among reformers who were trying to bring us back together again. And then, in the context of all of that, then we can start looking at people like Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, John Knox, yada, 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 all the others, and seeing those men in context of the century prior, I think we get a much better notion of what actually did happen, and who knows, we might actually learn something from history.
All right.
Okay. Well, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. I would like to look at this as we're looking at this era as a seismologist or a student of natural sciences would look at a tsunami.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I mean, a tsunami, as best I understand it, is a disturbance deep in the waters, deep in the ocean. It's a very small disturbance that you would not necessarily realize when it first comes to the surface. It might be a couple foot disturbance, or maybe even just a couple inches, but it begins to grow and grow. It continues as it goes across the ocean and becomes a very powerful under the surface force until it gets into, of course, shallower waters, and then it rises up and becomes this incredible tidal wave that just takes everything in front of it. In many ways, the theology of the church in the centuries leading up to the Protestant Reformation is the same thing. What we see is the tremendous wall of water hit the coast.
Right.
What we need to do is we need to look at the gentle disturbances that took place way out at sea. And so to do that, let's go ahead and just let's look at a couple areas and wonder at some of these. First of all, if we're going to look for someone to blame, we might want to blame it on the philosophers.
Okay.
Certainly what happens after Thomas Aquinas is a breaking down of the medieval synthesis. So we could blame it on people like Abelard, for those who were in the medieval history, or Averroes, the Muslim who introduces so much of new philosophy to us, Duns Scotus, or maybe William of Ockham. William of Ockham certainly, we've seen already, has an interesting role that he plays in countering Pope John the 22nd. So we might say that this all could be the philosopher's fault. On the other hand, there are other players too. There are mystics running around. We could certainly say that mystics like Meister Eckhart, once again back into the Middle Ages, or in the last part of the Middle Ages, we're starting into the earlier modern times, people like Joachim of Fiore, who had come up with these very wild predictions of the three ages in which we were about to enter into the age of the Holy Spirit, and the harbinger of that age was St. Francis of Assisi, and the church should take and get rid of all of its wealth and all of its structure and all of that. Well, that's what he was preaching. We could blame it on him. We could blame it on St. Malachi. In other words, we could go back to some of the medieval saints who were mystics and say, well, these guys were shaking things up. Well, maybe. We could blame it on some of the weirdos, like Peter Waldo, Waldo the weirdo, rebels against the hierarchical church. But I wonder whether or not, and I sat up and looked at this era, I wondered whether or not these were symptoms or were they causes. What about the monarchs? What about the kings? These good Catholic kings. Maybe they weren't so Catholic after all. After the age of Louis the IX, that great St. Louis, what do we end up with? We end up with his grandson Philip the Fair, Philip IV, who was anything but fair, and certainly anything but helpful to the Catholic Church and helpful to his own faith. Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire had a terrible battle with Gregory VII. We have Frederick I, Frederick II, especially Frederick II, who probably was an atheist by everything he did and said. And then we ended up with Louis of Bavaria, which we talked about before. This is that emperor who opposed Pope John the 22nd. These are not men who bring the community together, that bring Christendom together. They're dividing Christendom. When we look at all the petty monarchs, all the petty princes of Italy, for instance, and how it was impossible even for the Pope to live in Italy. because of these petty politicians and petty princes. These men were certainly not operating out of the best of intentions of of Christendom either. So you have all of that happening, and then at the same time, there seems to be, as I've mentioned before, there seems to be an energy drawing the church together, and it's sometimes too much so, as at Avignon, when you had a moment in church history when the pastor in a parish wasn't really sure whether he was in charge or whether he was going to get a dictate from the Vatican, not the Vatican, of course, from Avignon, telling him to do this, that, or the other. Remember that there were times when there was no pastor in some of the most important parishes of Europe. There was no pastor. Instead, they had an administrator who was actually a cleric in Avignon and running, the parish from a distance. That's no way to run a church. You had many cases where pastors disagreed with their bishops, and their bishop said, "No, you do this," and the pastor then wrote to the Pope at Avignon, and the Pope overturns the bishop. That's chaos by causing too much authority in the center.
Right.
And then you had the reaction against that, and that was these people like Peter Waldo and all those others that were driving the church in the other direction, and so you have all of that taking place too. Here you come up with people like Cardinal Dailly, which we've talked about before, and his idea that infallibility rests in the universal church, but not in the Pope and not in consuls. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything in the bottom line. So you have all of those sorts of things happening too, and so as you see the one and then the other, I think it's very important for us to be able to see the difference between the office and the individual.
Right.
And that's true of the theologians, but it's certainly true of the Pope also. Dante, he critiques, he lampoons individual popes. We see that in his Divine Comedy, and at the same time, he is very, very careful to differentiate the person from the office,
right,
from that pope, from the papacy. He's always very respectful of the papacy, and he's actually calling the popes to live up to the quality that of the virtues that the papacy itself calls them upon to do, and sometimes they don't do that. Right. This is a good time as we look at these things. It's a good time to instruct seminarians, which is of course what I do for a living. This is a great time to remind them that in their systematic theology classes they can talk all they want about the idea of ex opere operato, of the efficacy of sacraments, even if you have a sinful and a flawed priest. Okay, that's fine. It's a wonderful idea for abstract theologians. But the reality is that if you're going to be a priest, act like a priest.
Yes.
Live like a priest, And because the fact of the matter is that not everybody has the abilities of a Dante to differentiate between office and person. And, last year, Benedict Rochelle did the same thing in his book as he looked at the priest scandal in the United States. He pointed out the importance for especially bishops. He called upon the bishops of our country to act less like CEOs of big corporations, and listen less to your financial advisors and your lawyers. Listen more to spiritual advice. Be pastors. And I just remember George Weigel's book on John Paul II, and he mentioned that when he was made the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, that he would spend 2 hours a day in the morning just praying and writing and before the Blessed Sacrament, and people complained about that. And they said, well, you should be running your diocese. And his response was, Krakow has plenty of managers who can manage the church in Krakow better than me. I'm not called upon to be a manager. I'm called upon to be the shepherd. It's a wonderful lesson. It's a good lesson for us today, for our seminarians for tomorrow. It's a good lesson that was learned and not learned by leadership in the earlier church. And when it wasn't learned, we certainly see the consequences of all of that. Well, so what happens is that you have the opportunity by having flawed men who allow their flaws to take over. In Avignon, for instance, you then allow for the opposition to really get underway. And there you have people like Louis of Bavaria, the emperor, who brings together, if you remember, he brings this triumvirate of anti-centrists, I guess you could call him. Michael of Cesena, the head of the Franciscans, who now, of course, is gone his own way. William of Ockham, Franciscan also, who is marching to his own drummer. And then probably the most insidious of the group is a fellow that is least known today, and that's Marcellinus of Padua.
Okay.
Here is a man that is intending to counter John the 22nd. Here is a man who writes philosophically about his vision of the church, which is different from the church that had been in existence for over 1,000 years, for almost 1,300 years. He's coming up with a very different understanding of the church. And ultimately, this is going to be written up in a document called Defensor Paces, Defender of the Peace. But that's the title of it. And he is going to be partially responsible for this himself. So what's happening is these three individuals are gathering under the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor, who is neither holy nor Roman, but is taking cheap shots at the center of the church, at John the 22nd. And so you have then this group coming together, critiquing the Pope, and drawing up this document, which was read publicly in 1326 in Nuremberg, Germany.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing is, of course, there's no printing press back then. And so what they did was, after this was read before the emperor, in front of the emperor, by a couple of these theologians, then what happens, and it was Marcellinus of Padua was one of the authors. Another was Jean de Gendun, who was also a professor at the University of Paris. So the two of them are from Paris originally, and on the faculty there. And what they do is they read this, and then court scribes are given copies of this. There's only one copy, and then they're given copies, and then they write these out. Okay. And several copies, like a half dozen copies, are eventually made, and then, as best we can tell, there were some revisions made a little bit later on, and then these were disseminated all throughout Europe.
Okay.
And the reason why this is of interest is because one of the copies ended up at the University of Oxford. Now, I've been to the library at the University of Oxford. It's about twice the size of this studio.
Okay.
It's not real big. The original library is not real big. It had probably a dozen books in the entire library.
Wow.
They were chained to the wall so that nobody could walk off with them. And one of those books was Defensor Paces. Now, this will become important a little bit later on when we hear who's at the University of Oxford at that time. But anyway, let's just say that, first of all, it starts out with an attack on the Pope. It refers to Pope John the 22nd as the Great Dragon and Old Serpent. Well, that's directly out of the Book of Revelations. And it argues that the people's will is expressed in their representatives and in the executives who are appointed by the representatives. So this almost begins sounding like democratic government. And this is coming out in the 1300s. You know. Well, they're leading us. And what they say then is that these rulers are subject to the common law that everyone else shares, and that if they break those laws, then they forfeit the right to lead people. They're thinking, of course, of John the 22nd, because they're arguing that he has broken the common laws of the church, and therefore is not Pope and should not be Pope, and all of this. And then the people have the right to remove him. Now, where does that law come from? You know, you got to have some basis for this authority. You know, and their argument is that it comes from Scripture. Now, here we start hearing that sola scriptura. We're hearing this almost 200 years before Martin Luther. That's the thing that got me as I was doing all these readings, was that I was beginning to hear what I thought Martin Luther had come up with, in fact, about 200 years before him. You know, so okay, Scripture. If Scripture is the ultimate law, then The interpreters of Scripture are those people who then have the ultimate authority. They know the right, they know the wrong, and those, of course, are the scholars who study the Scripture, and others, the theologians.
Right.
So in all great decisions, and all great decisions are made, they should be, all great decisions of the church, definitions of doctrine, should be done, and discipline, should be done at councils, because councils are where the representatives of the people come together, and of course they should be dominated by and enlightened by these very bright periti, these theological experts. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, yeah.
Well, then the next question is, who calls councils? And of course we've already seen that traditionally it's always been the Pope who's called councils. They are arguing that it should not be the Pope, but rather it should be the state. The secular ruler is the one who should actually call councils because he is real.
Okay.
He's not an ideal. He's not a universal, but rather he is a real, honest authority. And so, that sort of bounces around that whole nominalism idea. They argue that all ecclesiastical authority is, in fact, unreal. And therefore, whatever the authority there is within the church, that authority comes from the state. And so the state then oversees church, and that includes church property, which is, in fact, the property of the state on loan to the church.
Okay.
That, by the way, is very, very intriguing to kings and emperors.
Well, I bet it is. All of a sudden that is theirs. Okay.
That's right. And what that means is that they can take it back anytime they want, in other words, seizures, or they can take it back little by little, which we would call taxation. And so here you have then this argument that, and this all comes from this document, Defensor Paces, Defender of the Peace, and the implication is that it's Louis of Bavaria, the emperor, that is that defender of the peace.
He's the real one.
He's the real one. Yeah. They argue that all temporal affairs centers on the emperor and on the state. And then in ecclesiastical affairs, that basically the clergy act as civil servants of the community. Now, once again, interestingly enough, many of these ideas are going to be found hundreds of years later in things like the civil constitution of the clergy in revolutionary France, in which they attempt to do the very same thing to the Catholic Church, to make it a department within government. Later on, we're going to find adherents, people like Wycliffe, who is the interesting fellow who happens to be at Oxford when that book arrives. Huss, Luther, Calvin, and right up to the French Revolution. All of them arguing basically off of this same concept, which denies that there's a divine nature to the church, and that there are apostolic origins. They're going to argue that it is a society that is a voluntary society that's been founded and brought together by the state or by groups of people or something along those lines, but it's not of divine origin. Yeah.
So tradition from Peter has already gone out the window in
the minds of these
guys.
Yeah, that's for sure. And they have to do that because if they accept Peter and they accept the apostolic succession, especially in the Church of Rome, all the way down, then they have to accept that the present Pope is also the center of the Church.
Right.
And that anyone to be united in the Church has to be united to him in some way. And so they have to deny that. Right. Otherwise, they have to recognize that they're in the wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they had to deny it from the beginning.
Yeah.
So the church has just managed to stumble along without any divine intervention up to this point, apparently.
From their point of view, yes. It's all just been a really interesting accident.
Okay.
Yeah. It's William of Ockham that takes these notions and gives a philosophical framework to this ecclesiological politics, if you want to call it that. You know, he's the one who argues that only tangible objects are real. You know, the things that you can touch are real, and that religion is itself not real, but it's otherworldly. It's totally transcendent. Now,
so does he believe?
Yes,
he does believe.
Yes.
Okay,
but his belief is that there are basically two worlds.
Mm-hmm.
You have the real world, the material world, and then you have the spiritual world, which is totally transcendent and totally other. What he's doing here,
and the two don't interact at all.
No, you know, I think something called the incarnation.
Okay. Here we go.
Maybe the creation. You know, there obviously in traditional Catholic understanding there are intersects between the totally immanent and the totally transcendent.
Right.
And these are those divine moments when God intervenes into nature, first of all creating nature and creation, and then later in the incarnation that Jesus is both man and God. I don't really know how or even whether William of Ockham deals with this, but this is what he's dealing with. This is his philosophical construct, and by doing that and then arguing that we live in the real world, then only the real stuff like emperors and armies and things of that nature and votes and mandates and legitimacy are the stuff of which we live our lives with. Anyhow, the fact of the matter is he died in Munich in 1348, and as we know that he died reconciled to the Church.
He did.
William of Ockham, did write to John the 22nd and ask forgiveness. He had been excommunicated. He was forgiven and received back into the Church, and he is buried in a church in Munich. His body is there today. Interestingly enough, on his death in 1349, John Wycliffe is 19 years old.
Okay.
He is a theology student at the University of Aachen. And so one wonders whether or not, or to what extent, he was influenced by people like William of Ockham. At Oxford. I said Ockham. He's studying at Oxford. And one wonders to what extent he was influenced by William of Ockham, whether or not he actually had the opportunity and took the opportunity of reading Defensor Paces.
Right.
That's sort of up in the air. One of our seminarians last semester did a paper in order to try to find that answer out for us, and the conclusion was that John Wycliffe used much of the same vocabulary and much of the same phraseology that's found in Defensor Paces, but it's not necessarily a smoking gun.
Okay.
So, you know, if he cheated, if he plagiarized, he did it cleverly, let's just say.
Okay. But we also know that there were a very limited number of books in this library.
Yes.
And so that in alone says quite a bit.
Yeah, that's for sure. And certainly, if he had not read the book, somebody had read the book, they certainly had the thinking, because much of the same thinking is there, even the same vocabulary.
And in discussions with other people,
right,
he would have encountered others who had read that, even if he hadn't.
However, interestingly enough, that was not a popular notion in England at the time.
Wasn't it? Okay.
No, by and large, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the church in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period in England, because by and large, in fact, all throughout, all the way up to Henry VIII, and even beyond Henry VIII, all the way up until Elizabeth I, the Catholic Church in England was quite strong. It was it had a tremendous following. It had one chink in its armor. It had one weak spot. And this is what Wycliffe actually uses in order to get his way. But he was not well received. His ideas were not, except for the king, who liked the idea of the taxation part, you know. But by and large, he was not all that terribly well received, and his ideas weren't. I'll tell you where the kink in the armor was, the chink, and that was fat bishops. Otherwise, we have a devout nation, loyal to the Pope. Even throughout the 100 Years' War, even when the Pope was French and in Avignon, you look at an English church that continued to be loyal to the Universal Church and continued to be loyal to the Pope. Also, one of the other things, too, about this is that the popes, for the most part, were, through the Avignon period, were pretty even-handed in all of that. They tried to walk a fine line in the midst of being in the midst of a war-torn nation, and at the same time not choosing sides, national sides. And so as a result of that, you have a lot of loyalty among English Catholics. And then also there's some very solid universities. These are, very solid Catholic universities. You look, for instance, at Oxford. And Oxford, of course, is a federation of many colleges. Mm-hmm. But Oxford really gets its start at St. Mary's Cathedral. That's where the early the lecture hall was. It was at the cathedral itself.
Wow.
The big lectures were all done at the cathedral. On the back side of the cathedral is a two-story addition, and the top story is the library, which we had talked about. That's the original library. And below that is an office space. And that was where the administration of the university was, and it was called the rector's office because the rector of the university was also the rector of the diocese.
Okay.
So that's why rectors in universities are called rectors. Originally, they were the administrator of the diocese who also did this on the side, and that was his office there. So there are real strong Catholic roots in the medieval universities. I mean, after all, the Catholic Church founded the universities as we understand them today, and so Wycliffe is not going to have a lot of opportunity at this point to throw brickbats. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of bishops who are sitting on their laurels, and many of these are being resented. First of all, it's sort of a family feud. A lot of them are of nobility. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, they are of nobles. And they're the younger sons of noble families who couldn't inherit the property.
Right.
Remember, primogeniture, the oldest male gets it all. And so the oldest male was inheriting all of everything. He was also inheriting all the responsibility to go over to France to fight for the King of England. Mm-hmm. His younger brothers were sitting back at home, fat and happy, and basically out of harm's way. Uh-huh. And so, and this extends out. It ends up being a point of some tension. Those bishops are sitting back in England. They come to dominate the House of Lords. You have the House of Lords, House of Commons. They have privileges in the House of Lords, which they fought very, very strong in order to maintain. And so as a result, more than one historian has noted that the poor of England could not see Christ in these men. What they saw was noblemen who had an easy life. Mm-hmm. And there you have it. So here comes Wycliffe. And Wycliffe's idea, his answer to this, and his answer is going to be jump back over to Marcellinus of Padua, William of Acca, Michael of Cesena. What was their idea? Was poverty. Remember, you go back to the Franciscan spiritualists and the mystics. And so he simply takes that one idea and inserts it and calls for evangelical poverty for the whole church. His argument is, why pay for anything? You don't need the sacraments. Oh, what? And his argument for that is, well, you're predestined. You're either going to go to heaven or hell already. God already knows where you're going to go, and so you're already going there. And so why support the church? Why pay tithes? Why do anything? You're already heading in one direction or the other. You want to find out more? Read the Bible. And so he even translates the Bible into English. Interestingly enough, he is not the first to do that. Mm-hmm. The bishops had themselves commissioned a translation of the New Testament into English years before. It's called the Bishop's Bible. And but Wycliffe doesn't particularly care for that translation, and so he does his own. And so this is going to be the authority. It is the only authority. Everything else is judged for that. Mm-hmm. Now, in Wycliffe's mind, then, what is the church? And his argument will be that the church is a fraternity of fellow travelers. We're all seeking along the same road, and so we all come together. And the church is supported by the state. The state sees, the king sees the fellow travelers, and so he pulls them together as a father, and he helps to create this. Sort of like the church then it could be compared to a city's symphony, or maybe to a park and recreation department. It provides a service to people who need this. Well, interestingly enough, his all power to the people concept got him in trouble. This in 1381, as he's going around telling people, seize control, you've got the power, you're the fellow travelers, you are the church.
Yeah.
We hear that, don't we?
Yeah, right.
Somebody ought to write a song about that. But anyhow, someone got the idea that, hey, this is right, and let's go do it. It's mine for the seizing. And it was a man by the name of Wat Tyler. And he organizes what's known in history as the Wat Tyler Revolt. It is a peasant revolt. And he goes all throughout England, encouraging the peasants to rise up and to get rid of the bishops. Now, this is exactly what Wycliffe has been preaching but not doing. Now you get somebody who's going to be doing it, and actually doing it, including killing the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh, my goodness.
That was the reaction of the king, and a lot of nobles. A lot of people in England go, whoa, wait a second, we've got ourselves a revolution on our hands. This is anarchy. We can't allow this to continue on. So what happens now is that the nobles in England close ranks, and they enforce law and order. And, of course, that's going to bring in both bishops and secular nobles, because they're both nobles, both in the House of Lords. And what's going to happen then is those secular nobles who have gotten to be so good at killing on the battlefield, killing knights who are in armor, are really good at killing peasants in the field. And so they went around slaughtering these saints, and then went on to slaughter the direct followers of Wycliffe himself. They called themselves Lollards. And I don't know where the term comes from, to tell you the truth, but these Lollards would go throughout England, and they would proclaim a gospel of all the stuff that we've been talking about. There are no sacraments. You are predestined. You have to find out what your predestination is. Read the Bible. If you don't know how to read it, we'll help you. Don't give any money to the church. Don't support the church, yada, 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 that kind of stuff. They ended up getting slaughtered also. The nobles were not in any good mood. They were in a pretty ugly mood. And so they went through and did all of this. In 1384, Wycliffe himself died. Natural death, evidently heart attack, something like that, but died of natural causes while attending Mass.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was buried at a churchyard by his own parish church, the little town of Lutterworth in England, and he was buried in the churchyard. This becomes significant because the Council of Constance will eventually have a keen interest in that churchyard. We'll see in a couple minutes.
Okay. But he died at Mass. He still attended Mass.
Yeah. I guess that's where his bread was buttered. I don't know.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, sure enough. His influence, some of the books that he wrote, eventually find themselves being copied and sent around to a couple places in Europe. And here you have some very interesting cross-pollination taking place, because his works, and we think that he had some kind of an influence by a document that comes out of Nuremberg, right, Defensor Paces. His works then find themselves resonating in Prague, all the way over into Bohemia, Central Europe again.
Wow. Okay.
And the individual who's going to popularize them is a priest from Bohemia, a man by the name of Father John Huss. Now, Huss read Wycliffe's book, De Ecclesia, concerning matters of the church, and he accepted predestination. That made a lot of sense to him. He also accepted the idea that the church should be subservient to the state.
Okay.
That sounded pretty good to him also. With that, he also began looking at the sacraments and questioning whether or not sacraments were efficacious or just symbolic. And then also he turned his interest also to indulgences, which we'll see a little bit later on was quite a deal back at that time.
Yeah, right.
At first, he was pretty much able to get away with just about anything he wanted to because he had a pretty important position. He was the rector of the University of Prague, and so he had that going for him. So no one could question his credentials, and he was the one who questioned other people's credentials. Also, he was a preacher, and a very popular preacher, because unlike other priests at the time, when he preached at Mass, he preached in Bohemian.
Okay.
So it was the language of the people, the common people could understand. And he preached, he loved to preach about righteousness, and all the more so because he loved to use examples of immoral clergy within the city itself. And unfortunately, he had more than enough fodder. Remember that after Constance, the religious orders reformed, and there were dioceses that did, and there were bishops that did, and there were individual priests who did, but there was no seminary education that we have today. And so many of the priests were very common, ignorant, poor, what they called mass priests. That's all they did was say mass. They didn't even have the faculties to hear confession.
Wow.
You had to have special faculties to hear confession. Some of these priests weren't even trusted to hear confessions.
Oh, my goodness.
So there was a priesthood of, which was in need of real reformation. And so he used that as an opportunity. In 1414, he received a summons to go to the Council of Constance. Now, remember, this is this incredible council. Now, this is the first council. This is the pre-council.
The pit where we're going to catch.
Yeah, the pit where we're going to catch all the foxes. And he was invited to come there to explain his theology. He was really excited. He grabbed some friends, and they very enthusiastically went off. He believed that he would be one of the great periti of the council. He would be one of those expert lights that would help to reform the church. And remember that he's looking at the people who are arriving at Constance, and they're people like Cardinal Dailly, who has some rather strange notions, and Jean Gerson and others coming from Paris. And so he figures he's going to do okay. He receives a letter of safe conduct from the emperor himself, Sigismund. Sends this letter of safe conduct. And so he begins traveling to Constance, all the way across Germany. And wherever he went, there was a huge crowd, which made him all the more confident. The reason why there was a big crowd was there was a Catholic bishop, a bishop on his way to the council, who knew that Father Huss was just a day or so behind him. And every village he went to, and every city he stayed at, this bishop said, "Now look, that terrible heretic Huss is coming. Don't go out to see him. You don't want to be around when he comes." Well, obviously, he was like a front man. Yeah, right. So yeah, everyone came, and so he arrives in Constance on November 4th. Okay, right as the council is not just gathering, and wrote friends letters, sends back to Bohemia, saying that people were coming to see him and visiting with him, and they were interested in his ideas, and he said, and they've offered to quietly take care of all these things. And he said, but I don't want that. I want an audience. I want everyone to listen to me, and then I'm going to win the day. So he's rolling for the big ones. He wanted to address the entire council, and he wanted to address the emperor. He would not speak publicly unless he had those two things. In actuality, he was in great danger because his ideas were heretical. And you can have heretical ideas, but to be a heretic, you've got to make that decision that you are more important than the church itself.
Right.
And he is definitely heading in those directions. One of the things also that makes it all the more dangerous for him is he's forgotten his international law, because according to the law, Gratian's decretals argues that if you receive a free passage, a safe passage from, for instance, the emperor or some king, that free passage or safe passage is solemn and must be honored under all circumstances, as long as you are a faithful member of Christendom.
Okay. Oh, well, there's the key word.
There's the key word. He didn't realize that if he got to Constance and if he were determined to be a heretic, then all the bets are off. He doesn't realize that. He thinks that the emperor's word is on the letter and it's going to protect him. In actuality, he should have known better, because one of the things, they're all being housed in various monasteries of various places. He gets housed in a monastery that's basically a prison. And the room that he's given is basically a cell.
Oh my God!
And he's got a guard at the door with a lock on it, and he's going, "Oh, they're really treating me nice," He's a prisoner.
Through the eyes of
and he's a prisoner.
Rose-colored glasses, huh?
But as the letters go on, he's beginning to realize that wait a minute, maybe they caught this fox, But at the same time, he got sick.
Okay.
And in the midst of his illness, a doctor comes to his apartment, cell, and knocks on the door and says, "I understand that you're ill, and I'm a doctor, and I've been sent to treat you." And he says, "Oh, well, that's wonderful, but I don't have any money." And he says, "Don't worry about it. My patron is paying for this. He heard that you were ill, and he's concerned for your health." He goes, "Oh, great. Who is this patron?" And he says, "Well, it's Pope John the 23rd. And he goes, "Oh, well, maybe I am so important. Maybe this isn't a prison after all. Maybe that's a guard guarding me rather than keeping me in." So he's deluding himself. Well, as time goes on, he is then transferred to another castle, Gottlieben Castle, which is definitely a prison.
Okay.
And then he's told that his appearance would take place on June in 1415. Okay, that's wonderful. And you'll have an opportunity to speak at your trial. Oh, trial. So there he is in June of 1415, 46 years old, gaunt. He has not been fed well. He's not been treated well for the last 6 months. Smelly. He's been in this prison, and of course the prisons are a little rougher than they are nowadays.
Yeah, right.
And he is brought before the consul at Greyfriars, refectory. And so all the consul fathers are there. And parts of his book, De Ecclesia, are read to the assembly. So he's there listening to this assembly and listening to what these charges of heresy based on his own book. And so they ask him, "What is your response?" And these are his words. They had scribes there that took down these words. He says this. He says, "I came here of my own free will. Had I refused to come, neither the king nor the emperor could have forced me. So numerous are the Bohemian lords who love me and would have afforded me protection." That's a nice start, isn't it? Well, with that, none other than Cardinal d'Ailly jumps up and screams out, "See the impudence of the man." Talk about, kettle calling the...
Yes, definitely.
Black, He is then told, d'Ailly tells Huss, "You must recant." And instead what Huss says, he says, "I have said nothing wrong. My book, De Ecclesia, is based on the very same notions that great reformer of the church and great theologian John Wycliffe has written." Well, I don't know if he knew it or not, but that same consul had just a month earlier sent word to England to have the corpse of John Wycliffe dug up out of the Catholic cemetery so it would not desecrate it, and have it thrown into a local river.
Oh my gosh!
And here's us saying, well, with that he was led away, and the Emperor Sigismund sat down and for everyone to hear said, well, that's the end of that. We scared him, no more problems.
Oops.
He'll recant, everything will be fine. On July 5th of that same year, and remember this is one day after the conclave had been formed, or this is the one day after the new council had been formed, remember, it had been called.
The real
the real council by the real pope. Yeah. And so it's been legitimized. One day after that, Cardinal Dailly and Cardinal Zabarali, who had been the convener of the first council, and 5 other bishops went to Wycliffe and said, look, this is to Huss. This is really serious. You've got to recant. You've got to do it now. And we'll give you one more chance tomorrow. Tomorrow's the day. Well, on the 6th of July then, Huss is brought to the church where Mass is being heard. He is not allowed to go into the Mass, which is a sign that you've been condemned as a heretic. You've got your one chance. After Mass is over, he is then led in chains. And he is sat down and then condemned. And he said the following, once again, his quote, I came here freely to this council under the public faith promised by the emperor. He's saying this looking directly at Emperor Sigismund. Promised by the emperor, here present, that I should be free from all constraint, there he is with all those chains, to bear witness to my innocence. Sigismund blushes. Remember, he's a great big huge guy with a blonde hair,
the blonde beard, yeah,
and now a very red face, and he doesn't say anything. And this, of course, is not a recantation. And so instead what happens is that he is then led out of the city, out into a field. And in the field, it's lit with bonfires of his books. They're burning his books as he's walking by. And out he goes to this one spot. This is a spot where a cardinal had earlier on buried his dead donkey. And so it's on that spot that he's then condemned to die, to be burned to death at the stake. He responds when a priest comes up and says, would you like to go to confession? His response is, I have no need. I have no mortal sin. And then he turns to Duke Louis, one of his supporters, and says, I have but preached and written to constrain men from sin, and in the truth of that gospel I will gladly die. And so it happened. He was covered with wood and straw all the way to his chin.
Wow.
Now, once again, thinking back on how you burn somebody at the stake, this doesn't sound very nice, but this is the most charitable way you could do it. If you go back to the Knights Templar,
right,
when they use charcoal, that is horrible. That's a terrible torture. Actually, being burned in this particular manner, you would suffocate faster.
The smoke asphyxiation.
Yeah, right. It is more merciful than hanging by rope, but of course it doesn't sound very good or look very good. And it has the advantage also of doing away with the body entirely.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, it was ruled that even his shoes and jacket must stay on him. So they're given to the executioner. But they didn't want any relics of this man left. And when it was all over, they learned a lesson. When this was all over and the entire pyre was burned, they then had guys come out and they took clubs and they broke up all of the bones and the skull and everything into tiny little shards and threw it into the Rhine River so there would be no relics.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is the Council of Constance answer to this, but it did not stop Hussites. It did not end John Huss's theology. What it did was it drove it, of course, underground. Back in Bohemia, there's a group of people following him. They're sometimes called ultraquists and sometimes called Calixtites. What it basically says is that they want to receive communion under both species. And their demands are actually quite simple. It's called the Articles of Prague, and what they demanded was this. First of all, the free preaching of the Word of God. Well, okay, that sounds pretty good. Secondly, communion under both species. Okay. Third, evangelical poverty for clergy. That might have gone over so well with a lot of clergy, but there it is. And then fourthly, secular punishment for immoral clergy. You can't argue with that, So those are pretty normal. But there's an element within this group called the Taborites, and they're radical Hussites who arm themselves and then announce that they have divorced themselves from the Roman Catholic Church, and they have formed together a denomination. This is the first example that I can find in history of a denomination, of a Christian denomination that is not tied historically to the Catholic Church. They denounce any of that, and they form together what they call the unity of brotherhood, or the unity of Czech brotherhood.
Okay.
There you have the elements then, the beginnings of what we'll see later on of support for Luther in the Reformation.
All right. Well, Father, it was a very interesting show, and we're at the end of the clock here, so if you would close with a prayer for us
Why
today.
don't we use the great doxology of
right.
praise. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be,
a world without end. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.